Hi again. We're now going to study a very complex but exciting variation in the Sicilian defense, which is called the dragon variation. And we reach this variation after the moves e4, c5, knight to f3, d6, d4, takes, takes, knight to f6, knight to c3. This is all well known. And here we studied the moves a6, the Najdorf, e6, the Scheveningen. But here black can also play other moves, like the move g6. So here we get into the dragon variation, which is a very interesting variation for black if black wants to play aggressively, if black wants to try to win the game, not only to draw. But it also allows white to attack. So here we get positions on which both sides will try to attack if we go for the main line, which is the one that I suggest, which is also pretty similar to the systems that we have studied so far. So here we're going to play the move bishop to e3, planning to play this idea of f3, queen d2, castling long, and then pushing the pawns. With a small nuance that we'll see shortly. After the move bishop to g7, here we play f3. And here black will normally castle, playing knight to c6, might also transpose two lines on which black castles, but castling here is by far the main move. And after queen to d2, knight to c6. So here we have to make an important decision. Here we're not going to castle straight away, we're going to play the move bishop to c4. Castling is possible and is also popular, but here black can play the move d5. So this would lead to another line that we don't want to focus on. That's why before castling, we're going to play the move bishop to c4. So I suggest that again you study one system against each line. So here we're going to play the move bishop to c4, and now black cannot play the move d5 because this would simply blunder a pawn. And here black normally plays the move bishop to d7. Black develops. Both sides develop. The moves are very natural for both sides here. White castles long. And here, by far the main move is rook to c8, a typical idea. Placing the rook on the c file, on the semi-open c file in the Sicilian defense is pretty normal. There are some x-rays against the bishop on c4, that's why here we're gonna play the move bishop to e3. So we get this position on which we have opposite side castling, similar to positions in the Najdorf or the Scheveningen. And we have similar ideas. Here we want to push pawns. We want to push the h pawn or the g pawn. We also have this idea of exchanging bishops because this bishop on g7 is pretty strong. It's indirectly eyeing the queen side, so exchanging bishops is a typical idea. And there's another difference with the other variations that we studied, because here the pawn structure on the king side is different, because black has this pawn on g6 particularly. That can be used for white to try to open lines more easily. Let's imagine that we put a pawn on h5, then here we can exchange pawns or we can try to open lines more easily. So this pawn on g6 can be used as what we call a hook in chess. So we have this additional option to open lines by attacking this pawn on g6. But the main plans are pretty similar to the other variations that we studied. If we reach these positions with opposite side castling, both sides will try to attack each other. The one that attacks more quickly normally will prevail. And here black has two main options. Actually, the move knight to e5 is the main move, I would say by far, but black has another major alternative, which is to exchange knights. And this idea to exchange knights is becoming more and more popular, mainly to avoid the other main line, on which white seems to be the one attacking first. So at least I want to mention the main ideas in this variation. So here, after taking on d4, we're going to take with the bishop. And then here black plays the move b5 to get the attack with the pawns pretty quickly by playing a5 and a4. Here in these positions, even if white or black sacrifices material, but if you can get a strong initiative, then it is normally very justified. That's why playing b5 is very interesting, because if we play, for example, h4, then black would also continue with a5, and a4 by black would also attack the bishop. That's why here in this position I suggest to play more positionally, and here the main move is actually knight to d5, hitting on f6, and here the main line goes knight takes d5, and after we exchange on g7 and black takes, we take with the pawn, and after a5, a3, we have less pieces, and this normally leads to quieter positions. So here after king to g8, the king gets out of this diagonal. White normally continues quietly with rook h to e1 because we don't have too many pieces to attack, but we want to play more quietly. We want to double rooks and put pressure on this pawn on e7. And white has a slightly better position. This is something that you can definitely play as white without too much risk. In fact, in these positions, black will normally try to play b4 to sacrifice a pawn for some compensation. For example, after rook to c5, rook to e3, b4. Black wants to open some lines, but after taking and taking, it is up to black to justify whether black has compensation for the pawn here. In the ball game that I share, white managed to convert this extra pawn, but these positions are actually complicated, but definitely not worse for white. And if black doesn't take on d4, then we get the sharper option, which is knight to e5. The idea of knight to e5 is to come to c4 and get rid of this bishop, or at least try to, because this bishop is normally one of the strongest pieces that white has. It is putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal, and as we'll see, there are a lot of tactical ideas involved for both sides. So here in this position, the main move that I also suggest to play is to play king to b1. This is a quiet move, but it's just anticipating aggressive ideas by black and trying to bring the king to a better position. And here black actually does something similar. Black normally plays a kind of a waiting move, rook to e8. And the idea is that if black also gets aggressive pretty quickly, for example after knight to c4, then white will simply trade and then continue with g4 and h4. These are complicated positions, but we can already see that white seems to be the one getting the attack quicker than black. So white is going to play h4, h5, bishop to h6, trying to open the h-file and trying to checkmate black's king. So here we have the main ideas, but when you play the positions, you need to be very careful about tactical ideas. Whenever you play bishop to h6, this knight on d4 might be hanging, so that's why sometimes the knight comes to b3. But in any case, this particular position already looks a bit better for white. That's why black normally here plays the move rook to e8. And here now white continues with the main plan of playing h4, followed by some g4 or h5 ideas directly, trying to open lines pretty much at any cost in order to give checkmate. And here again black plays the safer approach very often because knight to c4 will already lead to similar ideas after taking on g4. White is getting the attack very quickly. That's why normally black tries to stop these h5 or g4 ideas with the move h5. And here the position already starts to get very messy. White can go for g4 straight away, sacrificing pawns and opening lines, and this leads to positions that are very sharp and very complicated. But white also has a solid approach, which I suggest that you play if you haven't played these positions very often, because first you need to get a better feel for the position before starting to sacrifice blindly. So here the move bishop to h6 is quite solid for white, and as we'll see will lead to good positions for white. So bishop to h6 is also another main idea. We want to exchange bishops in order to leave black with less pieces defending the king, and then we want to follow up with some g4 ideas. So we after bishop to h6, black already has to be very careful. For example, playing the move bishop to h8 might seem like a logical option because black might want to avoid exchanging bishops, but now here g4 is just very strong. Just to illustrate with one variation, if black takes, then we can follow up with h5, planning to take. And if black takes, then here we can simply sacrifice material, just opening lines, queen to g5, we give a check, king to h7 is the only logical move. if knight to g6, then we would just capture, and we see that this pawn is pinned. So now we see how white bishops are just very powerful. And if king to h7, then we keep on attacking. So we only sacrifice an exchange and one pawn, but we have a lot of attack going on. So here we have this cover attacks against black's king, and if black continues king to g8, here we get this very nice checkmate after taking. Knight takes, queen to g6, bishop to g7, only move, and queen takes, checkmate. So this is not a forced variation, just want to show you how after bishop to h8, g4, white's attack just rolls. So keep in mind these ideas of opening lines. Once you have your pieces in good squares, sacrificing material to open lines should normally be very natural and very good. And here in the model game, I selected black played knight to c4, which I think is the best move, but I just want to mention another idea, in this case for black, which is to take, which seems like a bad move because now white's queen is very close to black's king, but here black can take on c3. This is a typical exchange sacrifice in order to break the pawn structure and try to attack white's king. Now this idea is interesting, but in this particular position it is not as strong as in a position on which black's pawn was on h7 and white's pawn on h2. So this inclusion of the moves h4 and h5 is on white's favor, because now the pawn on g6 is somewhat weak, at least much weaker than in a position on which black would have a pawn on h7. There's also the additional idea that after g4 we can open lines much more easily. So for example, here black has to be careful about this g-pawn, because after a move like knight to c6, which would be very bad, here again black can take on g6 because this f7 pawn is pinned. So after bishop to h6, black played the move knight to c4 in the modern game, and after white takes, this knight is normally very annoying there, rook takes, white trades bishops, and here again we can go for g4 ideas that are very sharp, but now we have less pieces, so here white played a very interesting move, which is a very solid way to play the position, trying to get a slight advantage, which is knight to d5, again trying to leave black with less pieces to defend the king. And here black played e5, which is an interesting way to defend actively. And after white took on f6, black is not in time to take on d4 because knight takes e8 would give a check. That's why black took on f6, and knight to b3. White has some slight pressure against d6, so now the position is a bit quieter, and black kept on playing actively, played the move rook e to c8, and after white took the pawn, black played bishop to e6, and after c3 and b5, black got some decent compensation for the pawn and managed to draw the game. So we have already studied the dragon variation, which is the move g6, and the main line on which we play bishop to e3, and then f3, queen to d2, and then bishop to c4, which by the way it's called the Yugoslav attack, which normally leads to very interesting and sharp positions.